Hello and welcome to Lecture 7 of Ancient and Medieval Worlds, this time Athens, Sparta, and the Peloponnesian War. This is the first part of a two-part lecture where we're going to particularly look at the city-state of Athens, which we've already looked at some before, but at this point we're going to be looking at Athens during its classical era of the democracy and some of its most important cultural accomplishments. Now, the Peloponnesian War is an idea that we keep coming back to, historically speaking. People have been comparing themselves to Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian War for generations. For the 19th century, the British like to think of it as them versus Napoleon, Athens versus Sparta. In the Cold War, Americans like to think of themselves as Athens and the USSR as Sparta, which is an interesting comparison to make because, and spoiler alert, Athens loses the Peloponnesian War, but there's a mystique here that's going on. Other Greek city-states were as big and powerful, like Corinth, Thebes, or Argos, but not as famous as these two, which is part of why we'll be covering them. And part of why we're going to talk about the Peloponnesian War, which in some ways is not a particularly impactful war, is because it's the subject of one of the first works of history by the Athenian Thucydides, and it covered in depth this conflict and set the standard for future historians for literally thousands of years about what a history should look like, including that it should look like it was about war and politics. Really, Thucydides is just one of the cultural touchstones of history, and I think to a large degree he and his work, the Peloponnesian War, is why we continue to study it, because of its great literary and historical merit. But that having been said, because of that, it's something that's worth knowing about, as are Athens and Sparta. Well, here we're starting with Athens, and in some ways Athens is representative of the move from kings to aristocrats to a more open system of government. But it actually happened later in Athens than in some places, and eventually was more extreme. We're not exactly sure when Athens became a polis. As we've talked about, it's kind of hard to know when a place becomes a city, since that's open to interpretation. Often these things happened organically over time, probably sometime between 900 and 700 BCE. Later Athenians claimed that they had been ruled by kings at one point, but we know very little about that time period. It seems to have been before literacy was rediscovered in Greece. Probably sometime before 700, the Athenians replaced them with officials called archons, which literally just means leaders. The words we get from this arch concept: patriarch, father leader; matriarch, mother leader; anarchy with no leader; monarchy, sole leader. And these archons were elected from among the aristocratic families and by the aristocratic families, at least at first. Now, as I mentioned when we talked about the development of the polis, Athens was a mess for most of the 600s and into the 500s, though, with aristocrats abusing their authority and wealth by enslaving the poor who fell into debt and fighting with each other. Numerous attempts at reform were only partially successful, but as we saw, the most famous, Solon's reforms, led to class being officially determined by wealth, not aristocratic birth, a crucial, if in immediate practice, minor change. The tyrant Pisistratus, as we saw from 546 to 527, brought an end to this factional conflict and a return to the rule of law, except that he manipulated the law so that he would be in charge. Pisistratus actually implemented many of the early reforms like Solon's more effectively and put Athens on the map both commercially and culturally. Now, a revolution in 510 led to the children of Pisistratus being exiled from Athens, and actually one of them even joined the Persians at Marathon, hoping to be made tyrant of Athens again on behalf of the Persians. But shortly after this revolt, and before the Persian Wars, in 508 or 507, a more enduring reform developed into the earliest organized and relatively comprehensive democracy or rule of the people then known in history. In this system, in Athens, all free adult male citizens had the right to vote in the Athenian assembly, and that was probably maybe 30,000, possibly as high as 40,000 adult male citizens in and around the city by the 450s BCE. Any free adult male citizen, in theory, had the right to propose a motion, although since voting had to be done in person, and that's a crucial feature of all Greek democracies, you couldn't delegate authority. Practically speaking, the wealthy were those who could afford to take the time off to go to the majority of the votes, and therefore had more access to the system. Although, of course, the poor living in Athens' city limits were also influential. It was the rural poor who couldn't afford to leave their farms who probably had the least amount of influence. But they technically had the same amount of rights. And this was a direct participatory democracy, unlike what we have in the USA today, or in fact most countries that we call democracies, which are representative. We choose people to go vote for us. We vote for the people who will vote for us. That wasn't the case in the Athenian democracy. You didn't have representatives voting for you at the ecclesia. Probably 5,000 or 6,000 people at least showed up to most assembly meetings. There was also no checks on the power of the Democratic Assembly, as we have with, for instance, the U.S. Constitution of checks and balances in government. And that was unusual in Greece, and is part of what led to Athens being known as a radical democracy. Citizens were also organized in the assembly and in many other social functions in the same units that they fought in the army, training together as hoplites in phalanxes or serving together on ships. Military and civilian organization was therefore blurred in the Athenian democracy. Now, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, another crucial element leading to total democracy for all freemen was the growth of the Athenian navy. Athens actually struck it rich by finding a silver mine in 483 between the Persian Wars, and voted to use the newfound wealth to build ships for its navy, which is part of how they could beat the Persians at the Battle of Salamis in 480. It also involved some pretty clever tactics, trickery, and some Persian overconfidence. Now, because anyone could row these ships, even the poorest Athenians who could not afford hoplite war gear for the phalanx were essential to Athenian military power, and in a government where politics and military organization so closely overlapped, that also meant that they had political power, and thought of themselves as having political power, which was almost as important. This system was still new and evolving at the time of the Persian Wars, less than a generation old at that point. For instance, the archons were retained, but they were no longer limited to the aristocrats. They now only handled the daily administration of government rather than policy. After a few years, they were no longer elected, but determined by lot from among the male citizens of Athens, like jury duty. And this was actually opened up to more and more classes in that system, the economic classes in that system that Solon had devised. The major elected office became that of the 10 generals. A term they used was strategoi, from which we get our word strategy. These were elected annually, and they were both political and military leaders, again, blurring that distinction. But principally they were military figures. But since it was the only elected office of any real significance in Athens, they tended to have a lot of political power as well. In practice, the Athenian democracy was very prone to demagoguery, where charismatic individuals dominated all debate and convinced the populace to vote for their policies. But the mob could be very fickle, especially if some general lost, and they often exiled the losers using the system called ostracism. Democracy encouraged certain intellectual and cultural achievements that Athens has forever become famous for, especially philosophy and theater. Philosophy grew out of the art of rhetoric, that is, training in how to make a good argument, which is something that I'm trying to do for you in this class. Because politics in Athens meant persuading your fellow citizens to vote a certain way, learning how to make effective arguments was absolutely essential. And teachers of rhetoric, people who were good at making arguments, flocked to Athens to train people, because that's where the money was for people paying you to train them in better rhetoric. Now, real philosophy developed beyond this, though, especially with a figure known as Socrates. He was a hero of the Peloponnesian Wars, not a really important hero, but he had fought in them, and particularly in an important rearguard action. And Socrates wanted to have his arguments not be about politics, as most of the rhetoricians did, but about the nature of reality, and particularly human nature and human morality. Socrates had been told by the oracle at Delphi that he was the wisest man in Greece, which he had trouble accepting until he realized it was because he knew how little he knew. Socrates was extremely annoying. He apparently sat around in the market all day badgering people about how they knew things to prove that they didn't really know anything. Now, we're going to talk more about Socrates soon, but suffice it to say that he was often mocked, and he was later executed. We don't have anything written by Socrates himself, but he inspired numerous of his students to write dialogues in which Socrates formed a major character, such as his famous student, the philosopher Plato. How much these dialogues represent what Socrates really believed is hard to say. But needless to say, we have enough about Socrates to have several different versions of Socrates, none of which are probably exactly what Socrates himself believed. The other great Athenian cultural development was theater, which began as religious festivals dedicated to Dionysius, the god of wine, but evolved into recognizable plays. Very few of these plays survive. Only a few dozen out of what we know were hundreds. But they were major annual events, and they would take all day for several days. They were initially performed only once, and then the Athenian judges would vote on which was the best of the plays that year, which was a very high honor. They were also weird because you would always wear a mask for your character. There were never more than 3 individual characters, and then there would be a giant chorus that would all represent one group, such as in the play, the earliest surviving play is about the Persians, which imagines Xerxes returning home after his defeat at Salamis. In that play, the Persians, the chorus is actually the old Persian men running around at Susa or Persepolis. Some of the other characters then would be Xerxes, his mother, and the ghost of Darius, his father. And to let you know who these characters were, you would wear these elaborate masks so that people in the back could hear. These plays were very much an extension of the public and open debates on Athenian society and politics, and they were often symbolic or even direct political and social commentaries, a very open and public way to criticize public figures, including Pericles and Socrates, or political policies like the Peloponnesian War. And here again, the Athenians could be quite fickle. Throughout the Peloponnesian War, they routinely voted top honors to plays advocating peace, and then promptly turned around and voted to continue the war in the assembly. And that's democracy. Now, the Persian Wars had made Athens famous. First, their victory at Marathon in the First War, and then in the Second War, their sacrifice of their own city and their use of their navy had been essential to the victory against Xerxes. This made Athens the natural leader of the defense against potential further Persian invasions when the Delian League, named after the important Greek religious center of Delos, was founded. They asked the Athenians to lead it. Delos was kind of like Delphi, but without the oracle. Within a decade of the victory, though, the Athenians were already starting to use the League as a tool of Athenian policy, forcing more city-states to join in or attacking those that tried to leave, extorting what was effectively protection money, and seizing territory valuable to Athens like forests for Athens' navy of wooden ships. Now, this didn't happen all at once, but it was noticeable from early on, and it got worse over the course of the decades, because having the biggest navy also made Athens the center of naval commerce and trade in the Aegean, and it could bully other cities into joining the League not just by threatening violence, but by embargoing them, refusing to allow them into any Athenian-controlled ports. One of the major architects of turning the Delian League into what modern historians call an Athenian empire was the Athenian politician Pericles. Now, he's often hailed by modern people as the equivalent of Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill as one of the great democratic statesmen of history, presiding over the peak of Athenian cultural achievements. But he was also a warmonger and an imperialist. Pericles was effectively the leader of Athens from 460 BCE until his death in 429. His supporters, like Thucydides, say he persuaded by virtue of his moral authority, but others then and now have called him a populist and a demagogue. The Spartans always saw him as their chief enemy in Athens. Pericles didn't always get his way, but he never really lost either. Pericles saw the true enemy of Athens as Sparta, their rival for control of Greece, rather than Persia. Pericles came to power during the First Peloponnesian War with Sparta from 460 to 455 BCE. Now, this wasn't the really big Peloponnesian War that we'll look at in Part 2, but a confusing period where competing factions in Athens shifted focus back and forth from fighting the Persians, with whom Pericles eventually made a peace, and the Spartans. Pericles was very explicit about acknowledging Athens as the leader of Greece, and he oversaw the move from Delian League to Athenian Empire by moving the treasury of the League from Delos to the Acropolis in the heart of Athens, and then advocated that they should use those funds to not only build more ships, which is what the funds were meant for, more ships to take the war to Persia, which of course they were no longer doing because Pericles had made a peace treaty with Persia, but to build magnificent buildings for the glory of Athens. Now, the most famous of these is the Parthenon, the temple to Athena built from 447 to 438 BCE, after the original was destroyed by the Persians when they had sacked Athens in 480. Like all polytheistic temples, it was a god's house, in this case the patroness of Athens, Athena. The Parthenon was built on a scale that the Greeks usually associated with egomaniacal tyrants, but it was voted on by the Athenian people at Pericles' instigation with the express intention of being a monument to the democracy. The finest sculptor and architect in Greece designed it, the same man who also designed the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Parthenon was designed using classical mathematical and artistic principles devised by the earlier philosophers, going back to the Ionian Enlightenment. For instance, its ratios conform to the golden mean. The sculptures from its pediments are still considered some of the finest works of art in the world. In fact, it set the style for classical building going forward. Putting the decorations around the top level of the building became so associated with Athens that this Attic style, and Attica is the name for the region around Athens, so the style is then Attic, became associated with the top floor of a building, which leads to our modern word in English, attic, for the top floor of a building. There you go. There's some fun etymology. Now, the Parthenon is an embodiment of classical Greece, the culmination of what started with the Ionian Enlightenment, using all the tricks of Greek science and art. But it is also the symbol of the Athenian Empire, not only built with funds stolen from the Delian League, but actually the structure that ended up housing the treasury from that league and its use by Athens. It is also worth pointing out that it is quite likely, and has been argued very convincingly by some historians and art historians, that it is modeled on some of the artwork that we saw at Persepolis. Now, that concludes part 1 of this lecture. In part 2, we'll shift and look at Sparta, which is a very different kind of city-state from Athens, and then we'll look at the Peloponnesian War and the enduring mystique of these ancient Greeks.